Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Friedrich Hayek, A Journey Through Ideas and Freedom. Chapter 1. A Child of Empires. Hayek's Formative Years. Friedrich August von Hayek was born on May 8, 1899, in Vienna, the magnificent capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a city of music, science, and intellectual debate, where grand palaces stood beside quiet coffeehouses. Young Friedrich arrived into a world full of culture, complexity, and contradiction. His family belonged to the educated middle class, deeply rooted in the Austro-Hungarian tradition of scholarship. His father, August von Hayek, was a respected physician and a part-time botanist. Though not wealthy, the Hayeks valued learning above all. Books lined the shelves of their home, and the atmosphere was one of quiet discipline and intellectual curiosity. Friedrich's mother, Felicitas, came from a family of civil servants, adding another layer of formality to the household. From a very young age, Friedrich showed signs of deep curiosity. He was not particularly playful, but he was thoughtful and observant. He would often spend hours reading, even when the books were far beyond his age level. His father's scientific interests exposed him early to biology and natural sciences. On family walks, August would point out different species of plants and explain their names in Latin. Friedrich didn't just listen, he remembered. Hayek's early education took place in a rigorous Viennese school system that valued precision and structure. Subjects were taught with depth and seriousness. Latin and Greek were considered essential for the educated mind, and Friedrich excelled in both. He also developed a fascination with maps and history, often imagining the rise and fall of empires as he traced borders with his finger. The world around him was changing rapidly. The empire he was born into was an uneasy mix of ethnicities, languages, and loyalties. Tensions between nationalities simmered beneath the surface. At home, Friedrich would overhear adult conversations about politics, identity, and the uncertain future of the monarchy. Though he was still a child, these early experiences planted questions in his mind about how societies hold together or fall apart. But it was not all seriousness. Friedrich was especially close to his grandfather, who had once been a professor of natural sciences. The old man would tell stories from his days in the laboratory, mixing tales of scientific discovery with moral reflections. These stories had a quiet power. They taught young Friedrich that behind every discipline, whether science, law, or philosophy, stood the human desire to understand and to build. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 disrupted everything. Austria-Hungary, once majestic and proud, was now pulled into a war it was not prepared to win. Friedrich was only 15 at the time, but the war left a deep impression. The colorful uniforms, once symbols of glory, became reminders of loss. Streets filled with anxious whispers and black-ribboned photographs in windows. In 1917, not yet 19, Friedrich joined the army. Like many young men of his generation, he was eager to serve, not fully understanding the horror that awaited. He was assigned to an artillery unit on the Italian front. There, he saw firsthand the chaos and cruelty of war, muddy trenches, broken bodies, and the utter disorganization of military command. What struck him most, however, was not the violence, it was the confusion. The chain of command often made no sense. Supplies were misdirected, orders were given without understanding of the terrain or enemy position. These experiences left scars that would never fully heal. Later in life, Hayek rarely spoke of the war, but he would often refer to the limits of human knowledge, the dangers of central planning, and the need for humility in leadership. For those who knew his story, it was clear that these ideas had taken root amid the smoke and disarray of the battlefield. When the war ended in 1918, the empire collapsed. Vienna, once a jewel of European civilization, became a place of hunger and uncertainty. The once proud Austro-Hungarian state was reduced to a small, struggling republic. Families searched for food. Currencies lost their value. Friedrich returned home to a city that no longer recognized itself. Despite the hardships, he entered the University of Vienna to study law. It was not law itself that fascinated him, but rather the structure of human society, how people make decisions, how order is maintained, and how ideas shape institutions. He took classes in economics, psychology, philosophy, and political science, moving restlessly between disciplines. He was searching for understanding, for purpose, for direction. It was at university that Hayek encountered thinkers who would shape his intellectual path. He read Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, and was intrigued by his ideas about how value arises from individual choices, not government decisions. He discovered Immanuel Kant, whose moral philosophy would later influence his own thoughts on law and liberty, and he listened to lectures by Ludwig von Mises, whose passion for economic freedom stirred something deep inside him. Mises, in particular, stood out. He was bold, clear, and unapologetically in favor of markets. While others embraced socialism as a cure for post-war suffering, Mises warned of its dangers. Hayek, still unsure, was skeptical at first. But as he continued to study under Mises, he began to see the power of voluntary cooperation, the subtle intelligence of the price system, and the way freedom, when respected, could give rise to spontaneous order. Though he had entered university as one of many confused young men in a broken country, Friedrich Hayek was slowly becoming something else, a thinker shaped by war, trained in law, awakened by ideas, and determined, though he didn't yet know it, to dedicate his life to understanding the fragile miracle of a free society. He was not famous, he was not even certain of his future, but the path had begun, and he was walking it. Chapter 2: Youth Amidst Empire. Early Education and Influences. Friedrich Hayek spent his early years in a world of grandeur and decay. Vienna, once the glittering center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was already showing signs of wear by the time Hayek reached childhood. Still, it retained much of its old charm. Elegant boulevards, grand coffee houses filled with conversation, and the buzz of intellectual salons shaped the rhythm of the city. In this world, young Friedrich was raised not only with comfort, but also with curiosity. Hayek began his formal schooling in a local gymnasium, an academically rigorous secondary school in Vienna. The gymnasium emphasized classical studies, including Latin and Greek, along with history, literature, and philosophy. While many students found the curriculum demanding, Hayek was naturally drawn to books. His reading often extended far beyond the syllabus. At night, while the rest of the household slept, Friedrich would read texts on biology, astronomy, and history under the flickering light of a bedside lamp. Though he was surrounded by science, it wasn't merely facts that fascinated him, it was the questions. He often pondered how nature organized itself without a central command, and how complex systems could arise from simple parts. These reflections, while innocent in his youth, later matured into some of his most influential theories. Hayek's home life was lively with discussion. At family dinners, the table was often filled not just with food, but with ideas. His father, although trained as a doctor, frequently spoke about the natural world with an enthusiasm that bordered on poetic. Friedrich's mother was firm and organized, managing the household with the precision of a scholar. She made sure the children followed strict routines, but she also encouraged them to explore music, art, and languages. One of the earliest intellectual influences in Hayek's life was his grandfather on his mother's side, Franz von Juraschek, a respected economist and historian. Juraschek introduced Hayek to economic ideas well before he was old enough to understand their full meaning. The older man would often speak of prices, value, and the dangers of government intervention in markets. Although Friedrich did not grasp all the nuances at the time, these ideas left an impression. Outside the home, Vienna offered a rich intellectual climate. Hayek grew up at a time when the city was teeming with thinkers, writers, and artists. The works of Sigmund Freud, Gustav Klimt, and Ludwig Wittgenstein filled the cultural air. Even as a teenager, Hayek would attend public lectures with a notepad in hand, sketching down phrases that puzzled or intrigued him. On weekends, he visited the cities, museums, and libraries. There, he discovered the joy of independent study, a habit that would accompany him throughout his life. Then came the Great War. In 1914, when World War I broke out, Hayek was only 15 years old. At first, the war seemed distant, something only heard about on the radio or read in the papers. But soon, the realities came closer. Food became scarcer. Inflation crept into daily life. Many of his schoolmates, older brothers, and eventually fathers were sent to the front. Some never returned. By the time Hayek turned 17, he too volunteered for military service. Like many young men of his generation, he felt a mixture of duty and restlessness. His experience in the army would become a turning point. Although he was never a hardened soldier, the discipline, chaos, and tragedy of war opened his eyes to the fragility of order. It also made him reflect deeply on authority, power, and the limits of control. These ideas would later shape his warnings against centralized planning. The war had disrupted his studies, but not his determination. After returning from military service, Hayek was determined to pursue higher education. He enrolled at the University of Vienna, choosing to study law initially. It was a practical choice, but he soon found himself drifting toward economics and philosophy. He found the law courses dry, but the economic debates thrilling. Under the influence of prominent professors and peers, he began to formulate his own ideas. One of the people who greatly influenced Hayek during his early university years was Ludwig von Mises, although their formal collaboration would come later. It was during these years that Hayek first encountered Mises's work. Reading The Theory of Money and Credit stirred something inside him. It was not just a book of economic theory, it was a challenge to think differently about the world. Hayek's youth was not without personal struggles. He was shy in social gatherings and preferred books to crowds. He often doubted himself, questioning whether he could ever live up to the expectations placed on him by family and society. Yet, he persevered. Through his early education and the tumult of the times, a quiet but determined thinker was being formed, someone who would later challenge some of the most powerful ideas of the century. In many ways, the Austria of Hayek's youth was a mirror of the young Hayek himself, rich in tradition, shaken by change, and searching for a new direction. As the empire crumbled, a new Europe was emerging. So was Hayek. Chapter 3. The Great War, Service and Awakening. In the autumn of 1917, Friedrich Hayek, then just 18 years old, left behind his books and lectures to join the Austro-Hungarian army. Like many young men of his time, he was driven not by fervent nationalism, but by a complex mixture of duty, restlessness, and a desire to prove himself in a world that seemed to be crumbling. The First World War had already consumed much of Europe. Cities lay in ruins, families mourned the dead, and empires, once seemingly eternal, were beginning to fall apart. Hayek volunteered for the artillery, a decision shaped partly by his interest in mathematics and engineering. He believed that artillery work would require precision and discipline, qualities he respected and perhaps hoped to cultivate in himself. It was not long before he was sent to the Italian front, high in the Alps, where snow, mud, and silence could be just as deadly as bullets. Life in the mountains was brutal. Soldiers lived in icy trenches and damp shelters carved into stone. Supplies were inconsistent. Communication lines were fragile. The war, in many places, had become static, a grinding, endless struggle with little progress. For Hayek, this was not the romantic adventure that some youths had imagined war to be. It was a slow erosion of certainty. During those long, freezing nights, Hayek often stared into the darkness, his ears tuned to the distant thud of falling shells. In those moments, his mind wandered. He thought of Vienna, of the comfortable apartment filled with books and warm food. He thought of his father's lectures and his grandfather's calm explanations of economic systems. And he thought about order, how it was built, and how quickly it could vanish. Although Hayek was not wounded in battle, the psychological toll was considerable. He witnessed comrades lost to frostbite, avalanches, and enemy fire. He saw officers make decisions that were either brilliant or reckless, but always irreversible. The war taught him more about authority, hierarchy, and unintended consequences than any classroom ever could. He saw how central planning, even in the form of military strategy, often faltered when it collided with the real world's unpredictability. This was Hayek's first intimate encounter with what would later become a central theme in his philosophy, the limits of human knowledge. No general, no matter how well-informed or powerful, could foresee every outcome on the battlefield. Orders issued from the top often made little sense on the ground. Soldiers adapted. They improvised. In some cases, they simply ignored orders to survive. It was messy. It was chaotic. But somehow, within that disorder, something functional emerged. Hayek's time on the Italian front ended with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. The defeat came not just on the battlefield, but also in the hearts of its people. The empire that had once united dozens of ethnic groups under a single crown now fractured into separate nations, each uncertain of its future. Returning home to Vienna, Hayek found the city transformed. The monarchy was gone. The streets were filled with hunger and political demonstrations. Inflation surged. Food and coal were rationed. Many veterans, like Hayek, returned to a life of uncertainty. There was no clear path forward. For a time, Hayek struggled. Like many of his peers, he faced the question, what now? Despite the devastation, or perhaps because of it, Hayek developed a deeper hunger for understanding. He enrolled again at the University of Vienna, this time with greater urgency and purpose. His experiences in the war had shown him that ideas mattered, that poor decisions by leaders, bad economic management, and blind ideology could destroy nations. Although he began with law, Hayek soon shifted toward philosophy, political science, and economics. He was no longer content to accept traditional thinking. He wanted to understand how societies could be structured more intelligently, how individuals could live freely, cooperatively, and with dignity, without falling into the traps of tyranny or chaos. In these years after the war, Hayek also began to see that central control, no matter how well-intentioned, could become dangerous. He had seen it firsthand in the military, and now he saw it in the fragile post-war Austrian government. Political factions fought for control, often proposing sweeping reforms and state interventions. Hayek, still young and forming his views, listened carefully. He was not immediately opposed to state planning. In fact, like many of his peers, he was initially intrigued by socialist ideas, but something inside him resisted. He remembered the battlefield. He remembered how top-down decisions often failed those at the bottom. Slowly, the seeds of skepticism took root. Amid the political and economic instability, Hayek also sought personal direction. He found work assisting in the reconstruction of war-damaged infrastructure and briefly considered a career in engineering. But the pull of intellectual life proved stronger. He wanted to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and write. Looking back, Hayek later described the war not just as a tragedy, but as a revelation. It stripped away illusions and showed him the raw, unfiltered consequences of human decision-making. It was, in his words, a crash course in the unpredictability of organized life. By the time Hayek graduated with his first degree, the world had changed dramatically, and so had he. The boy who had entered the army seeking discipline had returned a man searching for truth. The war had ended, but a new intellectual journey was only beginning. Chapter 4. Academic Pursuits: Law, Economics, and the University of Vienna. When Friedrich Hayek returned to the University of Vienna after the First World War, he was no longer the eager, wide-eyed student he had once been. The war had stripped away his youthful innocence, replacing it with an urgent sense of purpose. He did not yet know exactly where his intellectual journey would lead, but he was certain that ideas mattered, that they shaped lives, formed nations, and, when misguided, could bring civilizations to ruin. At first, Hayek resumed his studies in law, a field that promised stability and social respect. His parents had supported this path, seeing in it the promise of a secure future. But within the legal lectures and dense textbooks, Hayek felt a lingering dissatisfaction. The law felt rigid, too rooted in precedent and formalism. He was searching for something more dynamic, something that explained how human societies changed, adapted, and sometimes fell apart. That something came in the form of economics. During his law studies, Hayek began to attend lectures in economics and political philosophy. At the time, Vienna was a hotbed of intellectual activity. The war had broken the back of the empire, but the city still pulsed with vibrant thought. Philosophers, economists, sociologists, and psychologists gathered in lecture halls, cafes, and private salons. Debates often stretched long into the night. In this intense atmosphere, ideas collided, transformed, and sometimes ignited revolutions of thought. One of the towering figures in this scene was Ludwig von Mises, a brilliant and uncompromising economist who had recently published The Theory of Money and Credit. Hayek first encountered Mises's work during a seminar and was immediately captivated. Here was someone who seemed to cut through the confusion of post-war economics with clarity and conviction. Mises argued that the market was not chaos, as many believed, but a delicate and spontaneous order. Interference, especially by governments, risked disturbing this fragile balance. At first, Hayek was skeptical. He had, like many young intellectuals, been exposed to socialist ideals and the promise of planned economies. After all, central planning seemed logical. It aimed to eliminate waste, reduce inequality, and create fairness. But Mises challenged that view directly. In a now famous economic calculation debate, Mises argued that without prices generated by free markets, planners could not possibly allocate resources efficiently. It was not a question of ideology, he claimed, but of logic. Hayek was shaken. These were not merely academic arguments. He had seen systems collapse in real life during the war, in the failing Austrian economy, and in the disorder of post-imperial society. Now, Mises was offering a framework that helped him understand why. Soon, Hayek shifted his focus fully to economics. He pursued a second doctorate, this time in political science and economics. While still attending seminars and reading widely in philosophy and psychology, he found himself drawn not only to Mises, but also to broader questions of knowledge, organization, and society. What made a system work? How did individuals make decisions? Could a society evolve naturally without central direction? These questions led Hayek to explore fields beyond economics. He read the works of Friedrich Hayek, Karl Menger, and Eugene von Bombach, founders of the Austrian School of Economics. He also immersed himself in epistemology, the study of knowledge, and began reading deeply in psychology. In particular, he was fascinated by how individuals processed information and formed expectations about the world. Vienna provided the perfect backdrop for this intellectual awakening. Hayek often walked from his modest student apartment to the university, sometimes stopping in at Café Central, a famous meeting place for writers and thinkers. Over cups of dark coffee and plates of sweet pastry, discussions ranged from Freud to Marx, from Kant to Keynes. In this rich atmosphere, Hayek found friends, mentors, and most importantly, questions. He became a member of several intellectual circles, most notably the Geistkreis, or Circle of the Spirit. This informal group of young scholars met regularly to discuss economics, philosophy, and cultural criticism. Among its members were Felix Kaufmann, Alfred Schutz, and other rising thinkers. These meetings were lively, interdisciplinary, and often filled with passionate debate. No topic was off-limits, and no argument was safe from critique. For Hayek, this environment was both challenging and invigorating. It taught him the value of rigorous thinking and the humility to admit when he was wrong. Despite his growing interest in theory, Hayek never lost touch with the real world. To support himself, he took up a position in a government office responsible for handling post-war reparations and monetary stabilization. It was here, in a shared office full of papers, ledgers, and practical confusion, that he learned how economic theory collided with bureaucratic reality. This experience sharpened his understanding of inflation, currency stability, and the consequences of bad policy. It also made him more sympathetic to those who worked within flawed systems, doing their best with limited information. Meanwhile, Hayek's respect for Mises continued to grow. Although Mises was known for his sharp tone and stubborn demeanor, he took a personal interest in Hayek's development. Eventually, he invited Hayek to become a researcher at the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, which Mises helped to establish. There, Hayek began studying the causes of economic fluctuations, a subject that would later define much of his academic career. By the mid-1920s, Hayek had emerged as one of Vienna's most promising young economists. He had earned his degrees, gained practical experience, and found a mentor who challenged him to think more deeply. He had also begun to publish papers of his own, carefully argued, modest in tone, but unmistakably original. This period in Vienna was not just the foundation of Hayek's academic life. It was the forging of his intellectual identity. From the ruins of war through the narrow streets and heated salons of a city in search of itself, Hayek began to discover who he was and what he would fight for in the decades to come. Chapter 5. The Geistkreis and Early Collaborations. In the heart of 1920s Vienna, as the city pulsed with intellectual energy despite economic hardship, Friedrich Hayek found himself not just studying ideas, but living among them. The cafes were filled with heated conversations, and it was in this atmosphere of vibrant discourse that Hayek became part of one of the most influential and unorthodox academic circles of his time, the Geistkreis. The Geistkreis, literally, Circle of the Spirit, was more than just a study group. It was a gathering of curious minds, mostly young scholars from different fields, who shared one unshakable belief, that understanding the world required a conversation across disciplines. They met regularly in private homes, often surrounded by books, notes, and the smell of strong Viennese coffee. Sometimes the conversations stretched late into the night, shifting from economics to philosophy, from literature to sociology. Hayek was not the loudest voice in the room, but he was a careful and observant participant. He listened intently, often asking pointed questions rather than making bold claims. He was joined by intellectuals such as Alfred Schutz, who would become a pioneer in phenomenological sociology, Felix Kaufmann, a philosopher of science, and Erich Voegelin, who explored political theory through a historical lens. Though their fields differed, their curiosity united them. What made the Geistkreis unique was its atmosphere. It was not rigid or hierarchical. There was no formal leader. Each member contributed as both student and teacher. And perhaps most importantly, there was an unspoken rule. No idea was above question. For Hayek, these meetings were transformative. Though trained as an economist, he began to see that economics could not be separated from psychology, culture, or ethics. Why did people value certain goods over others? How did tradition shape decision-making? What role did language play in shaping knowledge? These were not purely economic questions, but they lay at the heart of understanding human behavior. In one session, Schutz introduced Hayek to the ideas of Edmund Husserl, whose phenomenology explored the structures of consciousness. Hayek didn't fully adopt the approach, but it sharpened his interest in how individuals perceive and process information, an interest that would influence his later work on knowledge and social order. Outside the Geistkreis, Hayek's academic career was beginning to take form. Under the mentorship of Ludwig von Mises, he secured a research position at the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, where he began studying economic fluctuations. His task was both technical and theoretical, to understand why modern economies seem to go through regular booms and busts, expansions followed by painful contractions. It was detailed work, collecting data, running statistical models, and analyzing trends. But Hayek saw beyond the numbers. He believed these cycles revealed something deeper, that economies were fragile systems, easily distorted by misguided monetary policy or excessive government intervention. Mises, ever the sharp critic of central planning, encouraged Hayek to develop a theory that could explain these fluctuations. In response, Hayek began crafting what would become one of his foundational insights, that credit expansion by central banks could mislead investors, causing resources to flow into unsustainable sectors. When the correction came, it was not just painful, it was necessary. This idea would later be known as the Austrian business cycle theory. But even as Hayek advanced technically, he remained deeply influenced by the broader philosophical conversations within the Geistkreis. He began to see that knowledge in society was not centralized or isolally measurable. People made decisions based on personal experiences, limited information, and subjective judgments. No single planner, no matter how intelligent, could gather all this knowledge or predict how it would change. This realization began forming the basis of what would become another major pillar of his later work, the concept of dispersed knowledge. At this stage, it was not yet fully articulated, but its roots were present in long conversations over tea, in annotated margins of his notebooks, and in quiet moments of reflection during his evening walks through the streets of Vienna. During this time, Hayek also published his first academic articles, including reviews and theoretical essays. They were not widely read outside Vienna, but they marked the beginning of his voice as a scholar. His writing style was careful, even cautious, but behind that caution lay ambition. He was building an intellectual foundation that he hoped would last. Despite his growing success, Hayek never became entirely comfortable with labels. Though influenced by Mises, he didn't see himself as merely a disciple. He disagreed with Mises at times, especially on questions of methodology. Hayek was more open to using empirical data and less rigid in his view of theory. He believed in principles, but he also believed that understanding the real world required observation, adjustment, and intellectual humility. This openness was one of the reasons Hayek thrived in the Geistkreis. While Mises was often dismissive of other disciplines, Hayek welcomed them. He saw that the world was too complex to be understood through a single lens. By the late 1920s, Hayek was ready for a new challenge. He had established himself in Vienna. He had collaborators, mentors, and a growing sense of purpose. But he also sensed that the future of economic thought, and perhaps his own future, would lie beyond the borders of Austria. One afternoon, as he sat in Café Herrenhof, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups, he opened a letter from Lionel Robbins, a rising economist in London. Robbins had read one of Hayek's papers and was impressed. He invited Hayek to come to England to lecture at the London School of Economics. Hayek read the invitation twice, folded it, and placed it in his coat pocket. He walked home slowly that evening, not speaking to anyone. The sky was overcast, and the city lights shimmered in puddles on the street. He felt the stirrings of a new chapter, not just in his career, but in his life. The Geistkreis had given him intellectual courage. Mises had given him economic discipline, and now London would offer him a stage. He didn't know it yet, but the next phase of his life would change not only his own trajectory, but that of economic thought across the world. Chapter 6. Across the Channel, Arrival in London, and Intellectual Ascent. The letter from Lionel Robbins had arrived like a key, one that would open a new world. In 1931, with a suitcase, a stack of lecture notes, and a bundle of uncertainty, Friedrich Hayek boarded the train that would eventually carry him across the English Channel to London. He had never lived outside of Austria for an extended period. The streets of Vienna, the stone corridors of the university, and the intimate Geistkreis gatherings had defined his life until now. London promised something different, a city of vast energy, institutional power, and a stage where ideas could ripple across continents. Robbins, a young economist at the London School of Economics LSE, had been impressed by Hayek's work on business cycles. Robbins was trying to reshape the LSE into a modern center of economic thought, one that would challenge the dominance of Cambridge and the rising influence of John Maynard Keynes. He believed that Hayek, with his clear logic and Austrian rigor, could play a key role in that mission. When Hayek arrived in London, he was met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. His accent was thick, his manners modest, and his ideas, by British standards, radical. He was not yet well known in English-speaking academic circles. and the Austrian school was still considered a continental curiosity by many economists in Britain. But Robbins had arranged a lecture series, and Hayek was determined to make the most of it. The lectures, later published as Prices and Production, were a turning point. In them, Hayek laid out a complex and original theory of how credit expansion could distort the structure of production, using a set of diagrams and conceptual tools unfamiliar to most British economists. He showed how artificially low interest rates could mislead investors into starting long-term projects that would eventually prove unsustainable. When the money supply returned to normal, these projects would collapse, leading to recession. Many in the audience found the lectures difficult, even impenetrable. But for others, especially younger economists, the ideas were thrilling. Here was a new voice, one not afraid to challenge the growing belief that economic downturns could simply be fixed by government spending. Hayek argued that these downturns were the result of previous errors, not just random shocks, and that attempts to fix them through intervention might only prolong the pain. Within a year, Hayek was offered a permanent position at the LSE. It was a remarkable rise from a war-torn student in Vienna to a professor in one of the world's most important cities. Yet success brought new challenges. At the same time that Hayek was gaining influence in London, another intellectual giant was commanding attention just 50 miles away in Cambridge, John Maynard Keynes. Brilliant, confident, and eloquent, Keynes had published his treatise on money and was developing what would become the general theory of employment. Interest and money. The two men could not have been more different in personality or in ideas. Hayek respected Keynes's intellect, but he strongly disagreed with his conclusions. Keynes believed that government spending could stimulate demand during downturns, thereby shortening recessions. Hayek, shaped by his Austrian roots and his experience in post-war Vienna, believed this approach was dangerous. In his view, it encouraged governments to spend recklessly, distort markets, and ultimately create more instability. The debate between Hayek and Keynes soon became the most famous economic clash of the 20th century. It was not just about policy, it was about how the economy worked, what role the state should play, and how societies should respond to crisis. Hayek published a sharp critique of Keynes's treatise, pointing out its internal contradictions and warning of its implications. The critique was thorough, but it failed to shift the growing tide of support toward Keynesian ideas. Keynes, with his charm and command of public language, soon became the face of modern economics. Hayek, more reserved and philosophically inclined, found himself pushed to the side, admired in some circles, but overshadowed in the broader academic world. Yet Hayek was not deterred. He focused his energy on teaching, writing, and refining his ideas. The LSE, under his influence, became a hub for intellectual rigor and open debate. Students from around the world came to study with him. He encouraged them to read widely, think critically, and never accept theories untested by logic or reality. Among his students was a young Englishman named Ronald Coase, who would later win the Nobel Prize. Others went on to shape economics, philosophy, and politics in ways that Hayek himself could never have predicted. His influence was quiet but deep, like water carving through stone. In his personal life, London offered Hayek a kind of anonymity. He missed the intense intimacy of the Viennese circles, but he enjoyed the order and rhythm of British life. He walked to the LSE each day through the grey, bustling streets, often carrying a small notebook in which he jotted down ideas, quotations, or questions to explore later. His writing during this time moved beyond pure economics. He began to think more deeply about the nature of knowledge, the limits of planning, and the philosophical foundations of a free society. The seeds of his later, more political work, such as The Road to Serfdom, were already taking root, even if he didn't yet know it. By the late 1930s, as Europe slid once again toward war, Hayek stood at a strange intersection. He had risen rapidly in a foreign academic world, become a central figure in a great intellectual debate, and helped build a generation of critical thinkers. Yet he was also aware that the tide of history might be turning against his ideas. Still, he believed that the truth mattered, even if it took time to be seen. Chapter 7: War and the Road to Serfdom. The clouds of war hung heavy over Europe. By the late 1930s, London was no longer just a center of learning. It had become a city of anxiety, blackouts, and whispered fears. Hitler's rise in Germany had sent shockwaves across the continent. Refugees from Austria and Germany, many of them intellectuals, fled westward. Some found their way to England, knocking on the doors of old colleagues. Others simply disappeared. For Friedrich Hayek, the personal and political had collided. Vienna, his birthplace and the home of his youth, had fallen under Nazi control in the Anschluss of 1938. Friends vanished. Some escaped, others did not. The Vienna, he remembered, the city of ideas, of long debates and candlelit study sessions, was gone. In London, Hayek watched as the war approached. When it came in 1939, it changed everything. The London School of Economics was evacuated from its capital campus and relocated to Cambridge for safety. Buildings once filled with lectures and argument were now silent. Sandbags lined the streets. Sirens echoed through the night. Hayek, though technically too old for military service, volunteered for air raid duty. He spent nights patrolling rooftops, watching for fires from bombs that fell in clusters of fear and flame. But even as the world collapsed outside, something stirred within him. War had raised new questions. What caused these totalitarian regimes to rise? Why had nations once so proud of their culture and intellect turned to dictatorship? Why did so many people seem willing, eager even, to give up freedom for the promise of order? Hayek had long resisted writing about politics. He believed in the patient work of theory, but the war had awakened something urgent. He felt the need to speak, not just as an economist, but as a citizen, as a man who had seen liberty lost in his own country. He began writing what would become The Road to Serfdom, not as a book, at first, but as a long memorandum. He wanted to warn Britain, and the broader Western world, of a danger he believed few were willing to see. At the time, Britain was embracing more state control, rationing, wage setting, centralized planning. These were seen not as threats, but as solutions to the chaos of war and depression. Even many economists, once skeptical of government, now supported national coordination of production and labor. But Hayek saw a different pattern. In his view, once a society accepted that the state could plan the economy for the greater good, it opened the door to something far more dangerous: the erosion of individual freedom. The same logic, he feared, had led Germany down its dark path. He wrote with passion and urgency. The manuscript took shape quickly, though he revised it again and again, sharpening the arguments, softening the tone. He did not want to sound hysterical. He knew he was going against the tide. When The Road to Serfdom was finally published in 1944, it caused an uproar. In Britain, it was received with polite resistance. Most academics dismissed it. Some praised its eloquence, but many found it alarmist. The idea that socialism, so widely embraced during wartime as a means of unity, might lead to tyranny struck many as absurd. But across the Atlantic, in the United States, the book took on a life of its own. The American edition, condensed by Reader's Digest, reached millions. Hayek, once a reserved academic in exile, became a public figure. For the first time, he found himself at the center of public debate, not in classrooms, but on radio shows, in newspaper editorials, and even in dinner table conversations. Some readers misunderstood him. They believed he was attacking any form of government action. Hayek tried to clarify. He was not against safety nets or basic public services. What he opposed was the belief that a society could be engineered, that freedom could be sacrificed in exchange for planned efficiency. Others saw in him a voice of warning, a defender of liberty, in a time when liberty seemed fragile. Not everyone close to Hayek welcomed the attention. Some friends distanced themselves. Even within the LSE, support was mixed. But Hayek had not written the book to be liked. He had written it because he could not remain silent. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, The Road to Serfdom opened new doors. Hayek was invited to the United States. where he delivered lectures at universities and think tanks. For the first time, he saw the possibility of a transatlantic conversation about liberty, markets, and the future of democratic society. Personally, however, this period was bittersweet. Though his work gained fame, his home life was strained. The war had worn down relationships, and Hayek, never the most emotionally expressive man, often buried himself in work rather than confront discomfort at home. Letters to his children were rare. He found companionship in books, in ideas, in solitude. Still, he kept writing. He began thinking not just about economics or politics, but about the structure of knowledge itself. How did people come to understand the world? Could central planners ever truly grasp the complexity of individual preferences, local customs, and subtle signals embedded in price systems? These thoughts would form the foundation of his later, more philosophical works. But at the time, Hayek still felt the heat of the present. The war was ending. A new world order was taking shape. And once again, he saw that ideas, not just armies, would shape what came next. He had no illusions of being a prophet, but he believed deeply that history could be steered, not through force, but through persuasion. And if that were true, then words mattered, books mattered. In a small office, surrounded by typewritten pages and fading maps of Europe, he kept writing, because for Friedrich Hayek, the road to freedom began not with slogans, but with understanding. Chapter 8. From Cambridge to Chicago, a transatlantic shift in influence. In the aftermath of war, Europe was a continent in ruins. Friedrich Hayek stood at a crossroads, not only in history, but in his life. The ideas he had defended during the darkest years of conflict were now being tested in the bright but uncertain dawn of peace. And yet, despite his growing reputation, he sensed that his intellectual home might no longer be in England. The London School of Economics had changed. War had drained its energy, scattered its faculty, and redirected its priorities. Keynesian economics, once a debated alternative, had become the new orthodoxy. Government planning, once seen as temporary wartime necessity, was now seen by many as the path forward. Hayek's defense of free markets, of decentralized decision-making, of individual liberty, all of it now seemed out of step with the new consensus. He found himself increasingly isolated. Younger economists at LSE looked elsewhere for inspiration. Colleagues, once willing to debate, now treated his arguments as relics of a past era. Though he continued to teach and write, Hayek felt like a man speaking into a wind that had already changed direction. It was across the Atlantic that the winds were beginning to shift in his favor. In the United States, the road to serfdom had struck a nerve. Too many Americans, still suspicious of large government and centralized authority. Hayek's warning about the dangers of economic planning resonated. His ideas found eager readers not only in universities, but also in editorial boards, business circles, and policy think tanks. Among those listening was errand director, a legal scholar and Hayek's brother-in-law, who had begun teaching at the University of Chicago. Director saw in Hayek's work the foundation for a deeper integration of economics and law, an idea that would later give birth to the influential field of law and economics. It was through Director's invitation that Hayek was offered a visiting position at the University of Chicago in the early 1950s. At first, Hayek hesitated. He was no longer young. The idea of starting anew in a different academic culture, especially one so dominated by technical, mathematical economics, was daunting. But the offer also promised something else: intellectual refuge. Chicago was home to a small but growing group of scholars who challenged the expanding reach of government and believed in the power of markets. Among them were Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and Frank Knight. Though each had his own views, they shared with Hayek a deep skepticism of central planning and a commitment to the role of individual choice in shaping society. Hayek accepted the invitation. Not as an economist, he felt his methods had become too philosophical for the new generation, but as a professor in the Committee on Social Thought, a unique interdisciplinary program that welcomed historians, philosophers, poets, and political theorists. It was an unusual fit, but also a perfect one. Chicago became a place where Hayek could continue to explore the deeper implications of his ideas beyond the boundaries of economics. He began working on a new book, one that would take over a decade to complete. It was not about markets or cycles, but about the nature of rules, order, and civilization itself. In the Constitution of Liberty, published in 1960, Hayek traced the history of freedom from ancient societies to the modern world. He argued that liberty did not arise from deliberate design, but from evolved institutions, common law, private property, moral traditions that had emerged over time through trial and error. It was a defense of what he called spontaneous order, and a warning against the belief that societies could be engineered from above. Though the book was praised by some, it was not a bestseller. It was dense, historical, and complex. But among those who read it carefully, its influence was profound. One of those readers was Margaret Thatcher, then a rising political figure in the United Kingdom. Years later, she would famously slam a copy of the Constitution of Liberty down on a table and declare, "This is what we believe." But at the time, Hayek had no idea he was planting seeds that would bear fruit decades later. At Chicago, Hayek was not always at the center of attention. He was older now, more measured, often content to let others lead the debates. But his presence had a gravitational pull. Students and scholars who met him often spoke of his quiet intensity, his courtly manners, and his insistence that ideas mattered deeply, even if the world seemed slow to understand them. He was also generous. He read drafts of student work, offered thoughtful feedback, and took seriously questions others dismissed. He remained skeptical of mathematical models that ignored human complexity, and he challenged economists to think beyond equilibrium charts and graphs. Outside the university, Hayek's ideas began to influence a wider network of intellectuals. In 1947, he had helped found the Mont Pelerin Society, a gathering of scholars, journalists, and thinkers committed to preserving classical liberalism in a world drifting toward collectivism. The society, named after a mountain retreat in Switzerland, became a quiet but powerful hub for the global defense of liberty. Through it, Hayek met scholars from Europe, the Americas, and even Asia. He listened to their experiences under socialism, military rule, and economic collapse. He saw that the battle for freedom was not only economic, it was cultural, historical, and deeply personal. Though far from Vienna, Hayek found in this international community a new Geistkreis, a new circle of minds. By the late 1960s, Hayek was slowing down. His health was fragile, his hearing fading, and the intellectual battles of his earlier years had left him exhausted. Yet he remained committed to his work. He had one more major project in mind, his most ambitious yet. But that story belonged to the next chapter. For now, Friedrich Hayek, once a solitary figure in wartime London, had become a quiet architect of a movement that spanned continents, crossed disciplines, and redefined how generations would understand freedom. Not by command, not by force, but by the persistent, often lonely, pursuit of truth. Chapter 9. Final Writings, Recognition, and Legacy. By the time Friedrich Hayek entered his 60s, the academic world had, in many ways, moved on without him. The decades following World War II saw the rise of macroeconomic modeling, econometrics, and increasingly mathematical approaches to economics fields in which Hayek had little interest, and even less influence. But while the spotlight shifted elsewhere, Hayek had not finished his work. In fact, he believed he had only just begun to articulate the deeper foundation of his lifelong concerns. The markets, the institutions, the spontaneous orders, these were not just technical matters of supply and demand, they were the fragile scaffolding of civilization itself. He had long believed that the rule of law, rather than centralized power or political will, was what preserved freedom in complex societies. Yet even among economists and legal scholars, this idea was often overlooked or misunderstood. Determined to explain it, Hayek embarked on what would become his most ambitious and complex project yet: law, legislation, and liberty. This was not a book, it was a trilogy. Over a period of more than 10 years, Hayek worked tirelessly to explore the evolution of legal systems, the limits of democracy, and the moral framework required for a free society. The first volume appeared in 1973. The second followed in 1976. The third and final volume was published in 1979. Taken together, the trilogy was a sweeping philosophical defense of liberal order, both a continuation and an expansion of the arguments he had first explored in The Road to Serfdom and The Constitution of Liberty. Hayek's writing style had grown more abstract, more theoretical. The books were not easy reading. They were dense, sometimes repetitive, and filled with long, winding arguments. Critics complained they lacked the clarity of his earlier works. But Hayek was not writing for fashion or fame. He was writing to clarify what he believed was the greatest threat of the modern age, the slow and silent erosion of liberty through well-intentioned but dangerously overreaching governance. For years, the books went largely unnoticed. Hayek's name still held respect among a small circle of economists and philosophers, but he was no longer a central figure in the discipline. In fact, by the early 1970s, many young students knew his name only as a historical reference in discussions of business cycle theory. Then, in 1974, everything changed. Without warning, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences announced that the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences would be awarded jointly to Friedrich Hayek and Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal. It was a surprising choice. Hayek had not published in mainstream economics journals for years. Myrdal, his co-recipient, was a prominent advocate of social democracy, a man with whom Hayek had deep ideological disagreements. Some believed the joint award was a political compromise, one economist representing the free market tradition, the other the interventionist. But for Hayek, the prize was an unexpected and deeply moving recognition of his lifelong effort to defend intellectual and political freedom. In his Nobel lecture, Hayek delivered not a triumphant speech, but a deeply philosophical meditation on the limits of economics. He warned of what he called the pretense of knowledge, the belief that economists could predict and control complex systems through data and models. He urged humility, restraint, and respect for the evolved wisdom embedded in institutions and traditions. His words struck a chord, not only in economics, but across disciplines. Many who had dismissed him as outdated began to reconsider his insights. In the years following the award, universities began to reprint his earlier works. New generations of scholars discovered the intellectual courage in his arguments. Political leaders, especially in the Anglo-American world, took notice. But for Hayek, the Nobel Prize brought more than recognition. It brought a kind of reconciliation. He had always believed that the power of ideas lay not in immediate applause, but in endurance. Now, decades after his first warnings had been largely ignored, he saw his ideas re-enter the public conversation. He traveled again, gave interviews, accepted invitations from universities that once closed their doors to him. In personal terms, however, these years were marked by solitude. His marriage had long been strained. Though he remained in contact with his children, the distance created by years of separation was never fully bridged. Hayek himself acknowledged, in moments of candor, that he had sacrificed much in the name of scholarship. Still, he took comfort in small routines, reading in the early morning, writing at his desk, walking through the streets of Freiburg, where he had settled later in life. He wrote letters to old friends, some long dead, others now professors emeritus themselves, and he continued, well into his 80s, to refine his ideas, sometimes returning to arguments he had made decades before, not to retract them, but to see them more clearly. In the final years of his life, Hayek received many honors, membership in prestigious academies, honorary degrees, and national medals. But what mattered most to him was not the praise, but the proof that ideas, when deeply grounded in truth and patience, could outlast fashion, ideology, and even generations. He passed away in 1992. At the age of 92, the world he left was vastly different from the one he had entered as a boy in Imperial Vienna. Empires had fallen. wars had come and gone. Ideas that once seemed unstoppable had collapsed. Others had risen. And somewhere among the footnotes and the speeches, the long lectures and quiet reflections, Friedrich Hayek had left his mark, not as a politician, not as a prophet, but as a quiet sentinel of liberty. Chapter 10. Afterlife of an Idea, Hayek's Enduring Influence. When Friedrich Hayek passed away in 1992, there were no grand processions, no crowds in the streets, no dramatic ceremonies. His departure was quiet, much like the man himself. And yet, the ripples of his life's work continued to move through history, influencing minds, institutions, and entire nations long after his voice had gone silent. For many years, Hayek had warned that the most dangerous threats to freedom did not always arrive as tyrants in uniforms. More often, they appeared in the form of good intentions, plans to engineer prosperity, to manage economies, to design better societies from above. He had argued that order could emerge from freedom, that the rule of law, not the rule of men, was the safest path to lasting peace and prosperity. In the decades following his death, these ideas would find fertile ground. Perhaps nowhere was his intellectual afterlife more powerful than in the political realm. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher had already drawn inspiration from the Constitution of Liberty as she rose to power in the late 1970s. She believed in the message Hayek had long championed, that too much state intervention was not only inefficient, but morally corrosive. She spoke of rolling back the frontiers of the state and reshaping the British economy according to free market principles. In the United States, Ronald Reagan also found Hayek's ideas compelling. Though Reagan was not an academic, he read and quoted Hayek, recognizing in his work the philosophical foundation for economic deregulation, tax cuts, and the battle against communism. Neither Thatcher nor Reagan followed Hayek's ideas perfectly. Indeed, Hayek himself remained cautious of political power in all forms, but their policies marked a visible return to the principles of classical liberalism, personal responsibility, limited government, and open markets. In academia, Hayek's legacy blossomed anew. Once considered out of fashion, his work gained renewed respect, especially among legal theorists, political philosophers, and economists seeking alternatives to mathematical models. The Chicago School of Economics, where he had once quietly taught, grew into a major intellectual force. Scholars like Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, and Robert Lucas, though different in method and tone, extended his belief in individual rationality and market order. Beyond economics, Hayek's influence could be seen in legal theory. His insights into the spontaneous order of common law inspired thinkers who argued that law should evolve organically, not be crafted in top-down fashion by parliaments or judges with grand visions. The field of law and economics, which he had indirectly helped seed, flourished. Meanwhile, in countries emerging from the shadow of totalitarianism, such as those in Eastern Europe following the fall of the Berlin Wall, Hayek's name became a symbol of intellectual resistance. Translations of The Road to Serfdom appeared in Polish, Czech, Russian, and Hungarian. University students studied his warnings about collectivism. Political leaders referenced him in speeches. He had become, posthumously, the philosopher of a newly reborn Europe. Think tanks and institutes around the world also kept his legacy alive. The Fraser Institute in Canada, the Cato Institute in the US, the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK, and many others cited Hayek as a foundational thinker. These organizations produced policy research and educational material steeped in the Hayekian tradition, a belief in liberty grounded not in utopia, but in realism and humility. Yet Hayek's influence was not unchallenged. Critics continued to argue that unregulated markets could produce inequality, environmental harm, and social fragmentation. Others claimed that Hayek underestimated the importance of public goods, or that he offered few practical solutions for modern problems like healthcare or climate change. Some feared that his ideas, when misapplied, could become a shield for selfishness or corporate excess. But Hayek never claimed to have all the answers. He had spent his life reminding people not of how much they knew, but how much they didn't. His central message that knowledge is dispersed, that no one mind or office or committee can fully grasp the complexity of a society, was not a defense of inaction, but a call for humility in action. In classrooms, his writings are now studied not only as economics, but as philosophy, history, and political theory. His name stands beside those of Locke, Smith, Mill, and Tocqueville. To some, he is a prophet. To others, a provocateur. But to all, he remains a man who refused to stay silent when liberty was at risk. Even now, when debates rage over the role of technology, centralized power, and surveillance in modern life, Hayek's questions echo. How much can governments know? Who should decide what is best? What are the costs of control, even when well-intentioned? These are not questions that end with a generation. They remain open, challenging, and alive. Friedrich Hayek's legacy is not merely a bookshelf of difficult books or a list of honors. It is the continuing tension between freedom and planning, between humility and hubris, between the seen and the unseen in human affairs. It is the legacy of a man who watched the rise and fall of empires, who lost friends to tyranny, who stood alone in crowded rooms, and who never stopped believing in the quiet, powerful dignity of the individual. And perhaps that is the truest kind of influence, not one that dominates, but one that endures. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.